This is Duke University.
So, hi Gary, good morning, good afternoon. We're going to get started here because we have a hard stop at 1:15. This is the second in a program on the moralities of migration. The program here is sponsored today by the Kenan Institute for Ethics, which I direct, and by the Program in Public Law, by the Center for International and Comparative Law, and by the Triangle China Forum on Urbanization and Immigration. And those various co-sponsors ought to tell you that this is a panel that's about a confluence of issues and concerns, at least three of them. One, that you sometimes see these three issues dealt with separately, occasionally together. We're going to have a mashup today that brings them all together. The first issue, so how many people here, if you have your iPhone, please take it out and hold it over your head. Okay, good. Okay, I'm seeing large numbers, or bad, depending. If you have a Mac or an iPod, yeah, we could go around the room and I think we'd cover things pretty well. So obviously there's been a great deal of media attention, and rightly so, to the question of Apple and the Foxconn factory and the recent report that was just put out on that and Apple's response. And so there's a series of issues dealing with labor and human rights in China. There's also a series of issues around the question of migration, and in particular in China about internal migration. The program we did that Margaret Hugh put together 2 weeks ago, which was on the Arizona law here in the US, tends to focus more on immigration to the United States. But of course, in many parts of the world, and in particular in China, you have significant internal migration. And that is not very far from the questions of labor and human rights that get caught up in that. And then we have a third layer here, which is the fundamental questions that get raised about creativity and collaboration and copyright, and that whole dimension that is overlaid both in and of itself when you look at creative issues dealing with Apple, but also how that intersects with the notions of borrowing and collaboration and copyright in China. So as I say, we have quite a mashup here, intentionally so, because these layers all really relate together. We have 4 speakers, and let me introduce them all right now, and then we will go straight through and then open up to questions and answers. Don Clark, who is a visiting professor of law here at Duke, visiting from George Washington University Law School, is going to start by framing some issues about labor structure and migration in China. And then we will move to Carlos Rojas, who is an associate professor of Chinese cultural studies, women's studies, and arts of the moving image at Duke. And he will then pull the picture back on talking about, from a creative and a novelistic perspective, on issues of capital and information and creativity in China. And then Eileen Chow, who is a visiting associate professor in Asian and Middle Eastern studies, will focus us directly on some of the issues of creative labor and copyright. And I think we're promised some very good pictures here, or slides of the fake Apple stores in China. And then we will ask Paul Hagen to bring it home for us. And he, of course, is a professor of law here at Duke, the senior associate dean for academic affairs. And also, correct, Paul, you are the chair of Duke's China Faculty Council.
I am.
So plenty of experience here, and Paul will comment on the recent FLA report and some of the issues that come out of that. So we're going to start directly, broaden out, and then bring it home in that way, and turn it over to you. With that, Don, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, thanks very much. Well, since the title of today's panel is Who Makes Your iPhone, let's just start out by saying the people that make your iPhone are migrant workers. And then the question is, well, what does it mean to be a migrant worker in China? What does that term imply? And that term can only be understood by understanding something about the domicile system in China, which is, people always use the Chinese term for it, which is hukou, H-U-K-O-U, so that's what I'll use also. This system was originally cooked up in 1958, at least it's reached its full fruition in 1958, and it was basically designed to keep peasants in the countryside and out of the city. And so it enforced a kind of a system of domestic apartheid in which, you know, if you were one class of citizen, you had a rural hukou, and if you were, that is domicile registration, which restricted your movement, and if you were another class, you had an urban hukou. Now today, because of the demands of industrialization, rural residents are often, in fact, allowed into the cities, but they're only allowed in as migrant workers. That is, they don't get an urban a domicile. They don't get an urban hukou. They are denied access to the various benefits available to urban residents. So their status is temporary, and it's permanently temporary. So they can't, you know, for example, through length of residence, eventually convert to urban residency. I think maybe it's probably easier for them to get a green card than it is for them to get an urban residency in China. Now, China's manufacturing miracle, and particularly in the export sector, has been created by these rural migrant workers. There's over 240 million workers. There's two ways of looking at this number. One way is to say there's about 150 million who are working away from their kind of you know, home district, but there's a total of maybe about 240 million who represent the number who have actually left the farm and gone into the cities or gone into kind of industrial labor. So depending on what you want to count, you can say there's 240 million or there's about 150 million. Anyway, no matter how you slice it, this is really an unprecedented, you know, social phenomenon to have so many people leaving the farm and coming to look for work. In a typical inland city, not known for its export performance, such as, say, Wuhan, they represent about 40% of those involved in employed in manufacturing. In Shenzhen, where the iPhone is made, migrant workers are about 70 to 80% of the labor force. Just to give you another interesting statistic, in Shenzhen in 2005, total population was 8 million. Of those, 1 million had a Shenzhen urban hukou. And 7 million are basically, you know, these people who under Chinese law are temporary. They're migrant workers. And they are, again, not able to take advantage of the goodies that the Chinese state offers to urban residents, and there's many of them. So, for example, when somebody tells you that, you know, everybody has medical insurance in China, that's really not true. That's only true for people who have an urban domicile, and even then, it's not quite as good as you might think. Rural residents don't have anything like that. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why we, you know, unemployment numbers don't tell us much in China. We don't really know much. If someone were to tell you the unemployment rate in Shenzhen, they would only be talking about, at least the numbers they're using probably apply only to those 1 million and not to the 7 million who don't have an urban hukou. Now, these migrant workers have long been kind of an industrial reserve army in Marx's sense, so when they weren't needed, they could be sent home, and as I say, they didn't get any of the benefits of the modern welfare state, even in its attenuated Chinese version, let alone the Western version. But this picture has actually recently been changing for the better, largely due to demographics and economics. In the last decade, that is the first decade of this century, the number of people entering the workforce began to level off and even to decline. And those are you know, young people entering the workforce are the people that the manufacturing sector, you know, for example, the iPhone manufacturing sector depends on. And so labor shortages began to appear. Factory owners began to complain about the difficulty of getting workers, I mean, at the wages that they wanted to pay. Of course, if they pay more, you get more workers. And pay has actually been going up noticeably since 2004, and laborers are able, maybe not collectively yet to the degree they would like to, but certainly individually, to exert kind of pressure on employers to improve working conditions. One important development from the legal side was this piece of legislation called the Labor Contract Law, which went into effect at the beginning of 2008. This is widely publicized in the country. Seems to have had some effect. The number of labor disputes in 2008 was twice as many. That is the number of disputes that rose to the level of being subject to arbitration or court proceedings. That was twice the number from the previous year, and the numbers have remained high. A couple of caveats, though. We don't quite know what these numbers mean, because one has to take into account two complications. One is that in many industries and locations, the labor contract law is, for one reason or another, and I don't know all the reasons, a nullity. Nobody pays attention to it. When the labor contract law was being debated within China, the coastal industrial sector, coastal industries, were opposed to it. Those in the inland weren't, and the reason is that the coastal industries knew that they would be more subject to its rules, whereas in the inland nobody would pay any attention to it, and therefore they would be at a competitive disadvantage to the inland industries if the law were actually passed. So there's vast swaths of China where probably nobody pays any attention to the labor contract law. It grants extremely extensive rights to workers, particularly rights not to get fired after a certain period of time, certainly more extensive than one has in the US, possibly more extensive than even in some of the sort of labor protective European countries. But, I know that in Beijing, you talk to people and they certainly don't believe or seem to think that they have some of these rights. The second thing we need to know more about who's bringing these labor disputes. For all we know, it may be white-collar urban workers who are bringing all these disputes. Just given what we know about China, I just find it hard to believe that it's all migrant workers who are successfully suing companies like Foxconn. And, in any case, Foxconn is probably not a major offender. It may employ some underage workers, but it probably pays their workers their wages on time and more or less what they were promised. It's industries like construction that are really the worst offenders, where workers work for months without getting paid, and then they find that the employer has skipped town. Finally, just a word about labor organization. The official trade union organization, which is the All China Federation of Trade Unions and then its subordinate branches at the local level, is kind of a typical Leninist mass organization that's controlled by the government and designed to serve the state. So workers do not, in fact, enjoy the right to organize and to bargain collectively via their own elected representatives. But in practice, on many occasions, we find, and again, this is a result really, I think, of demographics and economics, not because anybody in the center decreed that it should be so, but we do find that workers have been able to organize themselves, stage strikes, and bargain with management. It's a risky process for the leaders. Sometimes later on they may end up getting arrested. But at times it has been effective, and the risk of suppression can be minimized by keeping demands narrow and focused. And then finally, another word is that although the official trade union organization generally is on the side of employers and on the side of the government and not on the side of the workers, that picture also is much more complicated than it's traditionally been understood to be. One does find sometimes that at the local level, officials from this organization can be cooperative and even supportive of labor efforts. I know, for example, Han Dongfang, who is the exiled labor leader from the 1989 democracy movement, who now runs a labor support NGO in Hong Kong, has often found it possible to work cooperatively with local labor officials in trying to improve conditions for workers. So I will just finish then just by saying that, like everything else in China, the picture is very, very complicated, and any simplification is probably false. Thank you.
Don, thank you for that perfect setup for the whole panel. Carlos?
Thanks, Noah, and Margaret for organizing this panel. Glad to be here. I want to build on some of the things that Don was laying out and do so by talking about a book. I do literature, so I'm talking about a novel. It's called 我叫柳月金. My name is Liu Yuejin. It was published in late 2007. It was made into a film three months later that came out in January 2008. The same month, coincidentally, as the new labor contract law went into effect. And it centers around a migrant laborer in Beijing. I'll tell you a little bit about the novel in a second, but first of all, I want to think about the title. My name is Liu Yuejin. The eponymous protagonist is named after the Great Leap Forward, 大跃进 in Chinese, presumably because he, like the author himself, was born in 1958, the first year of the Great Leap Forward. Originally conceived as part of China's second five-year plan, the Great Leap Forward, it was intended to jumpstart the nation's transition from agrarian to a communist economy through a process of rapid industrialization and collectivization. Among other things, this agricultural collectivization was intended to sever peasants' ties to their family-owned plots of land. and reorient their energies towards national production. The campaign was a catastrophe, and as many of you know, it resulted in a famine that took the lives of tens of millions of people. Numbers are under debate, but somewhere between 18 and 40 million people died in a 2-year span from famine. Liu Zhengyun's novel, however, is not focused on the original 3-year Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 61, but rather what we could think of as the contemporary Great Leap Forward that has taken place in the 3 decades, beginning with Deng Xiaoping's Reform and Opening Up campaign that began in 1978, following Chairman Mao's death in 76, and was about almost exactly 30 years old when this novel was completed in 2007. During these 3 decades of growth China enjoyed during that time, the nation's GDP increased more than 100-fold in real yuan, and peasants, and just as the original Great Leap Forward attempted to sever peasants' ties to the land, this post-Mao Great Leap Forward has indirectly achieved a similar result. As the growing wealth and income disparities between rural and urban regions have driven millions or hundreds of millions of people to migrate from their rural homes to urban areas in search of work. The result, as Don was just saying, is a vast floating population of migrant labor that currently numbers between 130 and 150 million, depending on how exactly you count it. Okay, so it's against this backdrop that the novel is positioned. It's set in the contemporary day. Liu Yejin, the protagonist, is one of these migrant workers, originally from Henan, the same central province that the author himself is from, very, very poor province, one of the most populous in the nation as well. Liu works as a cook at a Beijing construction site. One day, Liu finds himself the victim of a theft when someone steals his waste pack containing all of his money, documents, and promissory note that collectively account for all of his net worth. Desperate to retrieve the bag, he draws in his connections with the Beijing underworld to try to identify the thief. The problem, though, is that the bag is stolen by some migrant workers from Shanxi, but then it's quickly stolen from them by basically a gang from Gansu. So basically all of these migrants in Beijing, and the bag is passing hands between them. In the process of trying to retrieve his own bag that he's desperate to retrieve, he runs across a woman's purse. In it, there is a flash drive belonging to the woman's husband, who happens to be a rich tycoon, and on the flash drive is a vast archive of information about all of his business associates. He, needless to say, is desperate to retrieve the flash drive, offers a great reward for it. The protagonist, Liu, loses the flash drive, but pretends that he still has it, to try to use his leverage. So basically, the novel revolves in that way, right? It's sort of a complicated shell game among, on the one hand, different sets of migrant workers in Beijing, and on the other hand, sort of this economic, political elite, and the protagonist is caught between there. So what does this have to do with the panel? I introduced the novel both because it's focused on migrant workers, but also to go back to the question that I think Don was hinting at the end of his comments of why we should focus on Apple and Foxconn, right? As Don was saying, they're almost certainly not, or they're not the most egregious offenders. They are the largest private employer in China. They employ more than 1 million workers, the vast majority of whom are migrants, but they're presumably, conditions there are presumably much better than there are among construction agencies, a lot of the smaller groups that either that don't pay wages regularly, either because they don't want to, or in many cases because they don't even have the money, right? And I would suggest that one of the reasons that it might be useful to focus on Foxconn and Apple is precisely, borrowing from the novel, is this notion of a circulation of information, right? And information about people, right? Information about populations. I think that one of the things that's happening now with this 100 million plus flowing population is that the way that China structures information about its own population is rapidly shifting. The last national census in 2010 was the first time that the census counted people where they are physically working rather than where they're theoretically assigned, right? So basically, new systems of categorization of information population control over superseding the old hukou system that Don was just talking about. And then the final point that I would make is what we have here is not only a vast system of migrant labor, but also one of the reasons why China is developing so quickly, this new Great Leap Forward that I'm talking about, is because it's a vast consumer market, right? And I think that this focus on information technologies and the kinds of tracking of consumer patterns and of population patterns that new information technologies allow are one of the keys to corporations, both Chinese, international, and joint venture, that are looking to China as the next big consumer market, the next sort of site of growth, and so essentially the flash drive that's at the center of this novel is sort of a symbol of the floating information that I think is the key to China's continued development. Thanks.
Carlos, thank you. So from the circulation of information, tracking of populations and consumers, to the creative use of storefronts in
Right.
China. Turn it over to Eileen.
I think so. Hi, I'm Eileen Chow, and we're in some ways the soft power sandwich in the hard power. And so we're really, I'm also touching upon issues of labor, but rather in this case creative labor, and also touching on the issue of circulation, but perhaps not precisely of migrants, but of ideas, products, and misinformation. So I just wanted to, is it projected? Okay. Oops. There's a little offness to my present, I'm sorry. But the word that I wanted to talk about today, and for those of you who are familiar with China, this is probably a very familiar term to you, but shanzhai, which is literally means mountain stronghold or mountain village, and is a term that you could traditionally might refer to the mountain stockades of regional warlords or bandits far away from official control. The way that most people understand this term now, shanzhai, is basically as a term for piracy or imitation. But I think there is a significant difference of the sort of rise of the use of term shanzhai as opposed to daoban, which was the term for a pirated copy earlier on, and precisely because I think that unlike piracy, which of course, as we all have had at one point in our lives, or our children have fantasies of being a pirate, that it's all about a kind of rootlessness or placelessness, right? It's about being outside, and it's about being not part of a kind of confine of a nation or a city. But one of the really interesting things to me about the term shanzhai is the mountain stronghold, even though there's, it has a kind of historical association with rebellion and outlaw, it's very much about a placehold, right? It's about a stronghold that's within a certain place-bound space. And so that's one of the sort of metaphors I wanted to kind of keep floating out there. But why the term shanzhai? Shanzhai was traditionally a lot, there are a lot of sort of arguments about its provenance, but one of them is that it comes from Cantonese slang in which shanzhai factories, which will bring us full circle, mean kind of ill-equipped, low-end, family-based factories that produce imitation goods. And the term sort of goes viral via the internet in the late 2000s and comes to refer to all sorts of fake brands, no-name brands, et cetera. What's interesting is as the term takes on its own provenance, shanzhai itself becomes a kind of brand. It's a kind of branding of no-name brand. And so what happens is in a kind of transformation from thinking of it as a labeling of anything that is cheap and inferior and to a kind of Chinese, particularly Chinese cleverness or ingenuity about imitation, not just as imitation, but imitation as either, rather than socialism with Chinese characteristics, this is capitalism also with Chinese characteristics, that, it's taking a product and making it better, cheaper, and more localized. An example, and another thing that was often stressed about the shanzhai-ness of these products, and the cell phone became the emblematic shanzhai product, but is that it was a third world circuit. So these phones didn't sell just well domestically. In fact, that in a 2006 survey, I'm sure it's even more now, that it took that shanzhai cell phones, so these kind of knockoff brand cell phones, in fact, took up 1/10 of the global cell phone market. And to give you an example of this ingenuity and localization, in 2008, for example, in Kenya, Obama phones were sold. to great success, and they were made in China. So this idea that somehow it's a kind of cultural mashup, but unlike, say, anti-consumerist art movements that you might be familiar with, such as culture jamming, which is a kind of reaction against consumerist culture, in this case, it's really capitalizing on it. So kind of culture jamming that is all about making profit. As I mentioned, the sort of most emblematic figure of the Shanzhai product, even though Shanzhai has come now to mean anything, including poodles dyed black and white, and they're called Shanzhai pandas, for example. But Shanzhai, this is our Shanzhai Britney Spears, etc. But that it's come to stand in for almost anything that is a little bit of a localized imitation. But the iPhone, of course, being the most desired product, is sold as HiPhone, SciPhone, and in fact, iOrange. And these all do very well. But one thing that I found really interesting was something that actually a blog, NGO worker who lived in Kunming wrote about in her blog. Her blog was, as she put it, followed by families and friends and 6 additional people, overnight had 100,000 hits. And then every other major media hit up. And what it is was she and her husband were just strolling around downtown Kunming in southwest China, in Yunnan, and she came across several Apple stores, which really shocked her. As she went in, she saw, these are her photos, and her handle is Bird Abroad, if you want to look up her blog. And she spotted the sort of very, as you see, it looks like Apple Store. The circular staircase, but as she looked closer, everything seemed a little off. They also had Apple Store workers. As you see, he is wearing the T-shirt and also the tag, but there were little variations, such as this young man's tag doesn't say his name, but just says Apple Store staff. And also, I assume a lot of you are Apple Store aficionados, you notice the Apple in the background. No Apple Store that you've been to says Apple Store under the Apple, right? So there's a kind of labeling, right, that in fact makes it a little bit suspect. But, and so one of the things is when this piece of news last July became viral, as you might expect, that there would have been an Apple response as well as a Chinese governmental response, and there was a kind of show trial of closing down 2 out of the 5 fake Apple stores found in Kunming. But it turned out that they were closed just because they were actually stores that didn't even have business licenses to begin with. So the other fake Apple stores were left to stand since they were legitimate businesses, just not selling legitimate apples. Another really interesting thing was, as Bird Abroad herself says, being the curious types that we are, I'm quoting her, we struck up some conversation with these salespeople who, hand to God, all genuinely think they work for Apple. I try to imagine the training that they went to when they were hired, in which they were pitched some big speech about how they were working for this innovative global company, when really they're just filling the pockets of a shyster living in a prefab mansion outside the city. So there's also this really, really interesting element, and the Wall Street Journal also tried to follow up with some of the workers, but of course by this point nobody wanted to talk, which is this aspect of the fact that in fact the workers inside, including a lot of the people you see in her photos, really believe that they worked for a global corporation, namely Apple. And so one of this really interesting things, when this kind of Shanzhai turn, sort of almost turn on itself, to have all these kind of interesting implications, because one of the things that the fake Apple Store has in fact been very, very successful, and a lot of people, conspiracy theorists especially, have speculated why Apple hasn't cracked down more on it, since Apple is notoriously jealous about and careful about its licensing around the world in the U.S., is that in fact there's a kind of tacit endorsement of this kind of fake Apple Store selling real Apple products, because it bypasses a lot of governmental strictures and local taxes, and allows for actually an easier circulation of Apple goods in Apple, which are Apple goods which are notoriously more expensive to be bought, when you buy them in China than when you buy them in anywhere in the U.S. or even in Hong Kong. And another issue is that the real Apple stores, or Apple-approved Apple stores that have opened in Apple, several huge violent outbreaks have happened, such as in January I'll come back to that. In January, when the iPhone 4S was being sold, a riot broke out. People were literally egging each other, and a violent riot over the standing in line for the iPhone 4S. So you see that in some ways that there's a kind of tacit acceptance of the Shanghai Apple Store as a kind of informal circulation of Apple products that is more desirable than say bootleg Apple, right? And another kind of interesting endorsement is that this is an official seller of an iPhone app in Hong Kong, but in their product launch, as you see, it's a fake Steve Jobs. And I think what a lot of these Shanghai consumers rightly perceive about Apple is that Apple is not about the phone or the iPad or the product. Apple is about the image, right? Apple is about selling the aura of Apple. And so what better way to then successfully sell that product is not Shanghaiing the phone, but Shanghaiing the store, Shanghaiing Steve Jobs. I end with two pairings of Shanghai-ness that I think maybe might be suggestive in our thinking about circulation of labor and information. One is a 2009 internet piece that was that went viral in China, and it was called "All of China is a Knockoff," 整个中国就是一个山寨, and using the term Shanghai, and it was signed Steve Zuckerberg. And Evan Osnos, the New Yorker reporter, revealed that it was actually a 25-year-old Chinese graduate student in communications named Wang Hongzhe who wrote the piece, but he had written many, many similar pieces, signed his own name, and fellow netizens just told him that he was spouting bullshit and being unpatriotic, and in fact, when he signed as Steve Zuckerberg, his piece went around in millions and millions of views, and so what's really interesting in this case is that if his way of sort of is being, of course, Shanghai Steve and Shanghai Zuckerberg got his message heard, which was actually anti-Shanghai-ness, which was all about authenticity and how China was killing its own innovation by always doing imitation products. I think a very interesting inverse character, a paired character, would be Mike Daisey, which perhaps we're all perhaps almost too familiar with. And of course, in Mike Daisey's rise and fall of his expose of China and Foxconn practices to his retraction and Ira Glass scolding him, right? But what's really interesting, and I thought I'd end on this point, is that the reason Mike Daisey's agony and ecstasy and agony of Steve Jobs worked so well is one, it played on that if you think of Shanghai as a term that denoted for Chinese as a kind of provincialism, right? It's our thing in our place, so don't bother us, because if we're going to make oranges, it's only for China. But Mike Daisey's piece was very much, it's our thing, our place. China's so far away, I can tell you whatever theatrical representation of China I want, and since it's our US Shanghai version, there's no way anybody in China or other people who might know about China might actually dispute your description of practices. And I think I just want to show that the way in which this notion of Shanghai actually works in peculiar ways and actually cuts both ways, and Mike Daisey's both success and downfall really rested on the assumption of the provincialism, or in fact the Shanghai acceptance of his U.S. Audience. So I thought I'd just end that.
Eileen, thank you. And Paul, from Mike Daisey to you, I think.
I'm going to start with three little sort of homely ideas. One of them is plays off Eileen's comments about authenticity. And these are going to be sort of personal little anecdotes. My son, who had been living in China for 7 years, said he was always asked, what was really going on? And his response was, everything you've heard about China is true. There is theft, there is protection of property, everything was true. The second little framing anecdote is one personal to me. I was negotiating on behalf of the law school for us to invite 2 Chinese judges to be trained at the law school. We had been to the National Judges College and a couple of other places. And we had an agreement on 2. And I got back to my hotel, and there was a little email from the people I'd been talking to. Would we consider 1,000? And I commented to a Chinese friend, the Chinese have a problem with scale. And he said, no, you're wrong. You have a problem with scale. And whenever we're dealing with China, the scale, the number of people on the move, the complexity of arrangements is mind-boggling. And then the third, again, little homely personal story, when my younger son would be asked whether he wanted X or Y, his comment to me was always, what are my other choices? And I'm going to use that to lead into the response of the international community, the Western community, to revelations about Foxconn. We start with levels of scale that I think are vaguely terrifying. You know, there are 250,000 people involved in the production of iPhones and iPads, and particularly at 3 absolutely massive locations that look like they're entire city-states. And how do we understand that scale? There were reports of really horrific things where people who were going through this experience of extraordinary kinds of conditions of these little fiefdoms had committed suicide, but there was a place where we had lost track of scale. The suicide rate was lower at Foxconn than in the population as a whole. And then the really powerful response to conditions where Apple was agreed and Foxconn agreed in a voluntary agreement of sorts to have the FLA come in and look at what they were doing. And the FLA found significant violations of Chinese law, of the sort of thing that Don had talked about. People were being made to work longer hours than they were allowed to under Chinese law. They found that workers didn't have a voice in management decision as they were required to have, and that was the FLA regards as consistent with good labor practice. They found a lot of things that were worrisome, but they also did a very thorough vetting of the attitudes of laborers. You know, what was it like to be a migrant? And again, Don has appropriately and helpfully given us a context that this is not such an obvious term, but the 2 factories they looked at that had the highest percentage of what anyone would regard as a migrant. They were not from their home province, but were working at these Shenzhen facilities far from their home bases. They were relatively happy. The ones who were living relatively close to their homes and working in Chengdu were relatively more unhappy. So we had framed this as a problem of migrants, and then we're getting data that seems to suggest something else is going on that we don't have entirely right. The other thing that was really interesting in the report focused very, very strongly on inappropriate demands for overtime work. And a number of these workers were working 11 days straight for extraordinarily long periods of time, conjuring up the worst excesses of our early industrial revolution. But when the workers were surveyed, almost 50%, 48% thought they were working a right amount of time. 33% said they wanted longer hours, and 17% felt that the overtime was excessive. And this is not a neocon argument that we actually, or a Panglossian argument that, in fact, we had created the best of all possible worlds. I'm sure that that's not correct. It may be a set of observations about the information that Carlos was talking about. What exactly do people think is appropriate? It may be the problem of my son's question, what are their other choices? These are very young people from very impoverished areas. The central issue I'm raising is, as we think about interventions into this extremely complicated set of places, how do we factor in the information that people have? Is it a situation in which it's possible, by imposing FLA standards, actually to raise all the boats, create a new information system in which we shift expectations? Or is this an exercise of a very different type in which we're insisting on a group of standards that don't line up with what people want or are interested in? I certainly don't claim to understand what's going on, but we've got some very interesting and peculiar things going on in the disjunction between what people say who are there in these factories and say what they want and what the prescriptions from the outside were.
Paul, thank you. Thanks to all four of you for incredibly incisive comments that all knit together in so many ways. We have 15 minutes for question and answer and open discussion. It seems to me there's again at least three issues on the table here. Maybe you all will see more or different. One is this question about the migration aspects here, and tying in from where you started off, Don, and you ended up, Paul, in this question of what do you make of the fact that those who are closest to home are the most unhappy, and that you've got these issues of creativity and imitation, which I think there's a lot to ask about. I have a question myself, but we'll wait on that. And then there's the question that Paul ended up with, which politically drives right to the heart of these matters about, are we engaging in shifting expectations, or are we setting inappropriate standards? And we have our own history to think about that at the same time. So at least three layers of issues and three sets of questions. Anyone who would like to weigh in on any of those or anything else, the floor is open. Gary.
Very good comments from the panel. I think I want to raise yet another issue, because there's a question of that why Apple and Foxconn? What do we learn about China from them? And there's one story around the migrant labor issue that this might just be a continuation of everything we've seen in the past. If you think about China over the last 20 years, it's become the factory of the world. More and more industries have more of their production in China than any other place, and it's been characterized as a race to the bottom story. People go to China because the wages are lower, conditions are more lax, and you can do things there. And then China, in addition, has the scale advantages and other things. But I think the Apple-Foxconn story also points to a real discontinuity in the China model. After 2008, 2009, with the recession in the West, a lot of those export factories and the migrant workers that supported them in the South started going bust. And there was a return migration. And in fact, even Foxconn, as I think Paul just noted, has moved from the coastal provinces like Shenzhen to Chengdu. And a very interesting thing, all those other industries that China was known for, the labor-intensive consumer goods, clothes, shoes, toys, appliances, sporting goods, labor costs as a percentage of total production costs were really high. And you could see why people were in China. When you look at the iPhone, labor costs as a share of total production costs are about 6% or 7%. A $1,500 computer costs maybe $5 to actually make in China or assemble in China, maybe $7 in Korea, $22 in the US. So the difference in production costs isn't really what seems to be driving China's advantage. So one of the interesting additional things, when you look at the 200,000 person Foxconn City plant, you know, of all those, the line workers, there's 7,000, 8,000 engineers that are needed to support them. And I don't know if people noticed, but in January, there was a New York Times series. It's called The iPhone Economy. And the first article was written by a pair of authors, and it started out with President Obama in a meeting with Silicon Valley types, and he had a discussion with Steve Jobs and says, well, so why is it, if labor costs are such a relatively small share of total production costs, we're not making those iPhones in the US? Nokia makes 30% of its smartphones in Finland. And it started to then unravel the Apple supply chain, saying Apple, the biggest, most lucrative company in the US, 40,000 workers in the US, 700,000 workers offshore. So the point, another point that's coming up is this is also a big story about US innovation. You start reading the Harvard Business School type articles, and what they're saying is China and East Asia more generally have been moving up this value chain beyond those labor-intensive goods where they started that were so oriented towards the migrant labor to this higher skilled set of goods where they and the other East Asian countries are capturing so much of the supply chain that it's going to be harder and harder for real innovation to occur in the US. So that's just adding another layer that the argument is China's not so much doing a race to the bottom, but in addition, there's a race to the top. And it is about innovation, and I think the iPhone, Apple story is as much about that, increasingly, as it is about the broader trends that I think people have rightly pointed to as well.
I want to comment, respond? I mean, I think it's an excellent kind of framing. Paul?
I think Gary's absolutely right. And I mean, one of the ironies after that downturn in 2008-9, I think the mayor of Shenzhen was saying this was a real opportunity for us to get rid of all of these low-class workers and send them back to the countryside so we could concentrate on things that were high value. Yeah, no, I endorse every part of what you said. It is a really interesting set of issues, and also issues surrounding the intensity of various kinds of industries in any place, which permits innovation, development.
I just want to see if we'll get a colloquy here. Other comments?
Well, I mean, it's multiple processes of displacement, right? I mean, when we're thinking about Apple being a U.S. corporation relying on China-based companies, factories to produce iPhones, but then Foxconn itself is neither U.S. nor Chinese, right? It's from Taiwan, which was leading this wave of technological production long before China got on the train, right? And the fact that Taiwan is then offshoring its own, huge company to its next door neighbors. I think another interesting part of that puzzle that you're describing.
I actually was going to make the same point about Taiwan, that if you look at the sort of history of Taiwan, when the sort of authoritarian government model and the sort of labor-intensive factory work and its transformation into high tech, and then the way it offshores. I think there's another story to tell that's not just U.S. China, right? It's precisely Taiwan and relationship to Southeast Asia, and actually now increasingly China's relationship to Southeast Asia, right? Right. So China is already seeing that, that they would rather be more high end, but they're not. But the way they're also offshoring, right? So there is that process that's going on. But I think all your points were wonderful.
Gary, did you want to come back on
I
this?
just want to add one other layer to the contradiction. On the consumer market side, I was doing work this summer with luxury brands, that Polo, Ralph Lauren, and all. China is now the leading luxury brand consumer market in the world,
absolutely.
with price points for all these luxury goods higher than Tokyo, London, Paris. So at the same time as we've got this the low-wage mass production worker issues, on the other extreme, as a consumer society, it's almost the opposite of that imitation part of it. There's the super wealthy also want to be able to buy the most expensive brands, and they're pushing the prices to the world's highest levels as well.
There's a question here, but I want to ask one follow-up to you, Gary Giraffe from Sociology here, and to the panelists, because I'm an outsider to some of the particulars of the China conversation, but what you just said, Gary, if we're looking into the future here, this panel starts and we're focusing on Foxconn and the treatment of low-wage migrant workers, but the story you just told of a race to the top suggests not only between the U.S. and China, but also within China, if they're going to send the low-wage workers back home, this is as much a story about a divide growing within China as it is a story about Western countries looking at China and the treatment of low-wage labor. Is that a fair characterization? Because that puts a very different spin on this.
And I've just heard people say more and more that the workers, however we want to generalize about workers, working class, are changing dramatically, and their aspirations to being part of a middle class and consuming more, et cetera, is part of that set of changes that's going through the society in a major way.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here.
Thanks for the panel's great discussion. I feel really happy that I can hear discussions about China, like in US, that Duke Law is kind of so familiar. All those Shanzhai things are like kind of really interesting. I'm quite interested with Professor Hagen's comment in his discussion. It's about what is the right time period that appropriate for those migrant workers in China. It's really interesting because I went to Europe and I'm staying in US and I studied in China. I feel that Chinese people are really hardworking, very much more hardworking than other people like in other countries. It's like when I went to Europe, I feel the pace is really slow. Every people like drinking coffee and playing with their dogs in the afternoon. But when you go to China, it's really quick. Everything's fast. And if you just ask some people, oh, you don't need to work that much, that many hours, and you can go home and play computer games or other things, they will feel bored. They will feel like, oh, this is not my life. I need to work. I need to change the condition for my family. So the right issue is, what is a right standard for Chinese people, the present Chinese people? Like, is it a standard a national standard for Chinese people is the best? I'm not sure on that. Because I think a best standard is a standard that fits into the culture, the situation of that country. It's not like a foreigner see, oh, those poor workers, they only have very low income and they are working every day, they stayed up every day. And foreigners may feel that's really cruel, that's really inhumane, but maybe for those people, they like to do that and they feel that in that way they can change their family's condition and that's the value of their life. So I'm wondering, can we discuss more about how to find the right standard, like for Chinese market, for Chinese labor market? Is there any way that we can do to find such a standard?
So, for the panelists, with the cultural the cultural, historical dimension here.
Could I just
Sure.
interject one thing? I feel that's a very rich comment that you just made, and there are actually many things I could debate, but I did want to say one thing, which is the China Labor Bulletin just recorded March 2012 as having the highest record number of worker protests in the history of tracking them. So I don't feel that everybody is happy. Right. I mean, in the sense that, obviously there is an internal problem, and and that most of these worker protests were actually for unfair overtime, and so that obviously, even though I take your point, something is going on that needs to be addressed.
Don?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point. And it applies in many areas too, not just labor, but also things like environment. And it becomes poignant because when you then work international trade issues into it, then the dominant sort of paradigm of international trade is one of like fair versus unfair trade, and so then people can have a reason to say that if any country does anything different from the way we do it, then that's somehow unfair. Now, obviously. It makes no sense to say that every single country has to come to the same conclusion on every issue, that the U.S. does, whether it's in protection of labor standards or whether it's in environmental standards. And probably people here would be annoyed if the Europeans started, putting extra tariffs on U.S. exports to Europe because U.S. had some kind of, unfair labor advantage because of its labor laws that are different from European ones. So so that's a terrific point that the U.S. And the international community in general should not necessarily be insisting that China do everything exactly the way they do it. That makes no sense at all. So then the question is, well, then what how do we decide kind of what the standard ought to be? And one way of maybe attacking this question is to say that to the degree that it looks like Chinese workers are I guess have a voice in setting those standards, then it become more acceptable. So, to the degree that Chinese workers have freedom to organize, then I think that it would make sense to kind of accept, whatever standards Chinese workers are willing to put up with or to accept. Obviously, that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but maybe that's one way kind of to look at it.
Yeah, I would just add very quickly, I think that one of the objectives of the labor contract law that went into effect in 2008 was not to put absolute limits on the number of hours that workers are able to work, but just to say that there has to be a compensatory mechanism, right, that acknowledges that, over and above a certain threshold that, and this is the way that labor, similar to the way that labor law works here too, right, that labor over and above a certain threshold, a number of hours per day, a number of hours per week, needs to be compensated at a higher rate, and that workers, should have some leverage in terms of whether or not they accept that overtime assignment. So, but yeah, no, it's a very interesting point.
Maybe I could add one more thing by way of sort of the law of unintended consequences, just on this overtime issue in particular, that given that the Chinese labor law makes it very difficult to fire workers. Obviously, that's going to make employers very reluctant to hire workers. And so if you're in any kind of an industry where you're anticipating that your need for labor will go up and down, you're going to tend to select a number of employees that's at the low level, not at the high level. And therefore, seasonally, when demand for labor goes up, you're just going to make people work overtime instead of, if you're in a really flexible market, you hire people when you need more, and then when you don't, you lay them off. If you can't easily lay them off, then you're going to tend to hire at the low end.
I just want to make one, again, cross-cultural comparison. The southern states bitterly resisted child labor laws when they were first introduced, challenged them in the Supreme Court. We set standards nationally on the ground that it was consistent with general human welfare. I think that is the challenge that the FLA has posed. Then the question is, well, what if that's not what the general workers want? Well, maybe it's false consciousness, good 1960s language here. But perhaps others outside of China or outside of Shenzhen have an interest in what the standards are. So it's beyond my metaphysical abilities, but I'm quite certain that those additional considerations are part of the discussion.
Well, we're going to come to a close there. I want to thank first all the panelists for interconnecting their comments and layering these issues. And I also want to thank Margaret Hugh, who organized this entire panel. So thanks for putting that together, Margaret, and thanks to all of you for coming. I think we're adjourned.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.